We've spoken before about the role of strategy and how important that can be to the success of any business, any organization, any real effort, to be honest. But my guest today is Faris Aranki, and he is an expert in not just the intellectual side of strategy, which is important, but also factoring in emotional intelligence and focus. The three things together will produce an effective strategy, and you can't really achieve it without having one or both or all three of those things. So we're going to hear a little bit more about why that is the case, how those three things interact, why it's important, and how Faris works with companies to help them achieve this. He's also got some great advice for any leaders or managers out there who are struggling to implement a strategy and get the team bought into it. And of course, we will, as always, be talking about his experiences with leadership and his lessons learned from his career so far. This is Leading with Integrity Leadership Talk, the podcast for first-time managers who are working in tech-driven businesses and teams and who want to be more effective, people-first leaders. Each week, you will learn the crucial strategies, mindsets, and practical tips that successful modern leaders follow to be engaging, ethical, and authentic managers who get the best from their teams. And we'll achieve all of this via weekly conversations with leaders, with leadership experts, entrepreneurs, and business owners, people who have already walked this path and have some amazing insights to share, with an added sprinkling of occasional solo episodes and some group chats where we'll have multiple guests. My name is David Hatch, and I will be your host. And leadership has always been a passion for me. After a career spent in a series of small businesses during 15 years in the aerospace industry, 5 or 6 of those at the end of that career were in a space startup in the UK. So trying to launch satellites into orbit, very cool stuff. And through all of that experience, I learned that the secret to successful management is in the ability to apply great leadership. And in turn, the secret to great leadership, it's all about your integrity, putting people before profits.
Welcome to the Leading with Integrity podcast. Leadership talk for the modern manager. With your host, David Hatch.
Hello and welcome back again to the Leading with Integrity podcast. Faris, thank you so much for joining me today. Excited to talk to you and hear all about what you get up to. And on that note, I'm going to hand it over to you, the virtual microphone, to introduce yourself to listeners, tell us a bit about your background, what you get up to, what gets you out of bed in the morning.
Okay, it's a bit like being a stand-up comedian. You have to do your own intro. It's ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the stage. So Faris Aranki. I run a small strategy consulting firm called Shiageto Consulting, which is all about making teams and people more effective, particularly around strategic decision making. So we facilitate strategy, and we also train in soft skills. Because strategy is nothing if you can't get others to buy into it and execute on it. So having great leaders who can take others on the journey is where we help. And so really, really great to be on your leadership podcast and discuss some of the things, because I've been doing this. I've been running my company for about 3.5 years, but I've been in the strategy and leadership space for a good 20 plus years. So seeing loads of good things and loads of not so good things.
Yes, no doubt. Love the strategy concept as well. I think exactly as you say, I think that for me is why communication has to be on any list of key leadership skills. I mean, in mine, it's one of my 5 C's of great leadership for exactly that reason. Because if you have the best strategy, the best product, the best idea in the world, but you can't communicate it effectively and clearly, what good does it do you? So I'm right behind you there.
Well, then we might as well just wrap up this podcast now then.
Well, we're in, absolute agreement. And thanks for listening, everyone. No.
Yeah.
I'm going to ask you some more difficult questions than that, obviously.
Okay, crank it up a bit.
Yeah, here we go. So you talk about strategy, you talk about soft skills. I'm particularly interested in your work where strategy, emotional intelligence, and focus interact. So how do you see that interaction working?
Yeah, so I see these as really super important, critical components and pillars of being successful. Now, just to give a bit more of my backstory and explain why I think these are important, I should tell the listeners or the watchers, I spent 15 years as a strategy consultant, so the kind who work for the McKinseys of this world and stuff. So I was paid lots of money to write strategies for companies, and my area of speciality was energy and utilities, so big oil and gas companies, imagine that. And what I discovered after 15 years of doing it, actually I discovered pretty early on, is 90% of the strategies we wrote never went anywhere. Not because they were bad strategies, but because they were missing these components, because people didn't buy into them, people didn't understand them. They weren't in a position of safety to say, look, I don't get it, or I don't. Yeah. So they just do nothing with it. It'd be an expensive paperweight, basically. And it could be because politics were happening in the boardroom and person A hated person B, so they were never going to agree on the same thing. Or because they were doing too many things. It's very, very common with companies. They're doing 100 things. So when you add something else to the list, it never gets done. So that's where I stepped back and said, look, to be really successful, you need 3 components. IQ, which is the quality of the ideas. So do you have great ideas? Okay. And if so, do you then have enough EQ, which is emotional quotient, to take people on the journey, ability to sell those ideas and get people bought into them? And then the third part is, do you have enough of this focus quotient, FQ, to really focus on delivering on what you've said is important? So it's not enough to over-index in IQ or one of those. You need all 3 components. That's why I put it together as an equation and said success is IQ times EQ times FQ. Which sounds a bit rude, but is actually the components.
No, I like it. It's a logical way of presenting it, and it highlights the fact that all of those things are multipliers of each other, aren't they? And as you say, essential to success, which, yeah, I like the approach. So the next question then naturally is, what does a successful strategy look like? Is it just that equation? What goes into making that equation actually work?
No, well, I mean, it lies in that equation, obviously. So, have a great idea, make sure it's stress tested, so make sure it's got good amounts of IQ, but and then the others are bought into it, right? Because as I said, a great strategy cannot be just something that looks good on paper. If nobody is doing anything with it, if nobody's executing it, it's not a strategy. It's just a really good thought document. And I've seen a lot of those over the years, very good academic papers. And so, yeah, there's got to come to life, and it needs that sort of others to buy into it, and it needs that focus to make sure it's actually completed. I've seen a lot of good strategies start, but not finish. So actually, you don't need the best idea. Sometimes it's not the best idea. Sometimes I go into companies and say, what strategy have you already got lying around? Often they've had an expensive consulting firm deliver a report. And I say, okay, which 10, 20% of this do you buy into? Let's do that. That's a much better strategy than having 100% great answer that's sitting around doing nothing. So that could be a good strategy, right? It doesn't have to be something radical, changing the world. It has to be something that people are engaged and excited and out there to deliver.
Yeah, and as you say, really, I mean, sometimes just having a bit of momentum is success in itself, isn't it? Particularly if you've got that massive tome of strategy that's sat on a shelf for however many years.
Yeah. I laugh because I wrote those, and but hey, that's what happens in life, right? So yeah, we can all have great strategies, and they can be simple things, and we all do strategies every day in our lives, whether we actually complete them about, learning a language, losing weight, these are all the visions. So you have a strategy that sits under it. It's exactly the same in big companies, and many of them just don't ever go anywhere.
Yeah. And from a smaller company perspective, so maybe a startup kind of environment, I found in some of the companies I've worked for or with, without giving any names, quite often in those kind of situations, the bigger problem is less about having a strategy no one buys into and more about not having a strategy, or not having one that's clear and understandable by everyone in the business, or just not communicating it consistently.
Oh, yeah, 100%. And I work with big corporates and startups. And as you say, often with the startups, they haven't structured anything and made it clear to everyone so on the same page. And they say, look, we're three friends who are all founders. We all must know what the strategy is. But even like a 1% difference, they all leave the room and say something slightly different to the workforce. So then that gets said slightly different. And then you end up going, why are you working on this? And you go, oh, well, that's what I thought our strategy was, right? So you need that absolute clarity. But also what I find with smaller companies is actually more around the focus. Because there's usually small teams, they don't have enough arms and legs. They really have to decide, actually, these are the 5 things we're going to do. Therefore, these are the rest of the things we're not going to do. And that's where they find hard, because they want to chase everything. And so that focus quotient really comes into play for smaller companies.
And the skill of prioritization, I guess, as well, and planning as well, just what, when, and in what order, that sort of stuff. Yeah. Completely.
It's always fascinating how people find it difficult to let go of ideas that they came up with. Right?
Yeah.
It's that disassociate, even if it's not the best idea in a bunch, they'll keep it somehow in the ecosystem and say, oh yeah, well, so you need to find a way to help them reframe it and detach a little bit sometimes.
Yeah, and I think the opposite problem as well is getting people to buy into an idea that wasn't theirs. Particularly when you get to senior management levels, I think that gets really difficult.
It does. Yeah.
Anyway, let's not bash the senior leaders anymore. So what advice have you got then for leaders, for managers, to ensure that they are integrating these 3 elements into their strategy? What can they do to make sure those really bed in? And
I think go through each of those pillars. It's fundamentally what I do, or my team do when we go into companies. Go through each of those pillars and ask just some simple questions around them. Right? On the IQ side, have you got the best ideas, or first of all, have you reached out and got a wide enough cross section of ideas? Because often people just exclude people around the table for one reason or another, natural biases. I can give you loads of examples of teams that I work in where for one reason or another they've excluded somebody without even realizing it, because so are you getting all the quality ideas? Have you picked the best one? Have you stress tested it? Lots of people pick an idea, but how do you know it's going to work? And there are lots of tools and techniques, and I can talk about these, that you can use to stress test strategies before investing hundreds of millions of pounds launching them. So on the IQ side, those are the sort of questions to be asking. On the EQ side is, do people buy into this, right? Am I selling this enough? Do I believe in it? What are sort of some of the responses I'm hearing? Because human beings invariably say no. I've got a great slide that was given to me very early on in my career, which says the 28 ways people say no without saying no, right? And it's just our natural reaction where we go, oh, well, yeah, that won't work here. Or we tried that. Or so do a sense check of how many of these no's. So are people actually buying into your stuff? Can you vary how you communicate it or get excited about it to try and then the final thing is, as you said, how many other things are you doing? How much of your actual focus, and I like to say, imagine you have 100 points of focus. How much are you giving to this? And if it's too low, then you're doing too many other things, right? Because if it's important, it should be one of your top 5 priorities.
Yeah, definitely. It makes sense. And I guess my next question is, what role does the creativity, the perhaps the more artistic view of it play in all of this?
Well, it plays throughout, right? If let's take the IQ pillar, your creativity should be unleashed there to generate as many ideas as possible before you select which ideas. So many people just come up with 1 or 2 ideas and go, that's the one. And you're like, it's much better to have 100 ideas and pick one out of them than to have 2 and pick one. Because the good thing is if you come up with 100, or it doesn't have to be 100, it could be 20. And if your initial idea is rubbish or faces barriers, you've still got another 19 or 99 to pick from. Whereas if you only have 2, not only are you not sure they're the best ideas, you don't have a large amount, and it's so you unleash your creativity there. And I do simple exercises with teams to generate more ideas, more whatever the topic, once you've defined what the problem is. But and then you can apply that same sort of thing on the EQ side. If people aren't buying into it enough, have a creative session around what ways could we get people to buy into this? What ways could we change how we're communicating about this to overcome people's resistance, and it might be how you present it or the language you use or where you present it. There's lots and lots of ideas. And then similarly, if you find you're doing too many things, do some creativity to say, well, how can we kind of combine some things? How can we rationalize this? Do what I call pre-mortems, which is go through and imagine what happens if you remove each of those activities you're doing. What's the worst case scenario? And then you can kind of see, actually, it's not that bad if we remove that activity. So there's lots of ways to kind of turn around your creativity to sort of bring each of those pillars to the fore.
Yeah, and I think one particularly important aspect of all of this, particularly, well, from my own experience anyway, is the importance of getting that feedback. So I think, you've mentioned it already, but that whole loop of achieving buy-in, the change management piece, the overcoming the natural human resistance to anything new or different, it's all part of that whole feedback thing for me, and how you get people on board. You also might learn something from what they tell you about some of your ideas or the way you've tried to implement something. And I think it's very important from a leadership perspective to make sure you close that feedback loop, as it were.
Completely. And, they often say, I know we're going to talk about great leadership qualities. They say humility is a key one, right? Because it's very easy for different reasons to assume you have the answer. And even if you do have the answer, it doesn't hurt. And I learned this personally the hard way, setting up a business on my own. Life is much better. Your business is much better when you tell more people about it, your ideas, and bounce them off it. I don't know about you, but I remember the first time I was a best man and I wrote a best man speech, and I thought it was hilarious. Right? And I remember my sister saying, go on, let me have a listen. I went, no. And she eventually wore me down, and she listened to it and she went, well, that's not funny. That's not good. That doesn't make sense. And, while my pride was hurt, she was absolutely right. And I realized a valuable lesson, just sharing it. And it doesn't have to be with everyone, but sharing it makes it instantly stronger and better. And that's where the humility comes in. Particularly as you get more senior, you lose that challenge because of your title and thing. People are afraid to approach you, but actually stepping out of your zone and going, do you know what? I'd value your opinion on this. I don't know the answers. I'm not the hero of every story. That feedback loop is invaluable.
Yeah, I think you're right. Particularly what you say there at the beginning about leaders thinking they have the answer. I think there's also a very similar misconception where they think they're supposed to have the answer. And it's almost like that self-imposed stress and pressure, isn't it? Of, well, I'm the leader, I'm supposed to know the answer, therefore I've got to come up with something. I can't be seen to go and ask someone else for what it is. And I think that one's equally damaging, actually. So, yeah.
You're spot on.
Okay, so one more question about strategy. Can you give us an example of a strategy you've seen in perhaps a well-known company that you thought that was spot on, really like the way they've done that?
Oh, I mean, sometimes it's the simpler strategies, that are the best. Now, most people are sort of taken by marketing strategies, but actually some of the best strategies, let's take the energy sector where I come from. Yeah, I often say a good strategy comes from defining the actual problem you need to solve. Then you could come up with what are all the options for doing. And that's what strategy is have a vision or have a problem you're trying to solve, come up with all the options, pick the one. That's your strategy, right? How do I do it? So there's an energy company out there who looked at the challenge of call centers. Have you ever rung a call center for your gas or electricity bill, David? I can see the look of pain on your face, but yeah. Sadly,
yes. I'm in an ongoing argument with one as we speak, in fact.
Okay, me too. High five. Right. So most energy companies take the approach to call centers as they are there to manage customer inquiries. Okay, so the question they ask is, how can we handle them in the most cost-effective way? So they tend to have one agent for 500 customers right? Because that's what they discover is about how much one agent can handle. Now, one energy company out there looked at this and said, we're solving the wrong problem. That's just catering to the complaints. How about if we could make the complaints or the interactions disappear? So instead of hiring a call center agent to deal with 500 agents and therefore pay them minimum wage of about £20,000 a year, they said, what if we hired PhD coders, mathematicians, so that whenever someone rang, they went into our code and changed it forever So that problem never happened again. So instead of paying 20 grand a year, they'll pay 150 grand a year for these people. And by doing that, they were able to have a ratio of initially 1 to 5,000. So, right. And so these people would sit on the phones, answer the phones. They'd say, oh, you got a problem with the bill. Right. I'll recode it. So that problem never happened for anyone else. And what they found is the call volumes came down and down and down. So they started with 1 to 5,000, then they had 1 to 10,000. So what I love there is they looked at what is the problem, picked a strategy that was counter to everybody else, but really solved the underlying problem. Okay. And they were bold because it could have backfired. It could have been very costly for them, but they backed it. They went with it. Lovely example of make sure you have the right vision, pick the right option, and double down on it.
Yeah, and solve the right problem, as you say. Yeah. I love that. You'll have to tell me afterwards which energy that company is
I will.
For unrelated reasons.
Yes, of course. Yes.
What has been your best experience of being led?
I've had loads of great experiences of being led, but I guess, do you know what, when you're more starting out your career, you're more impacted and you're more sort of open to things. So I look back at some of the leadership I experienced when I was quite junior. Now, two things spring to mind. I actually started my career, David, as a school teacher. So some of the great leadership was from my head of departments and the headmasters in the school and the tips I was given, and some super valuable lessons. And often you learn most when you've just failed, so I think back to my first year as a school teacher, and I used to teach, A-level maths and economics. So I used to teach 11 to 18-year-olds, and I don't know if you've ever thought of being a school teacher. It's quite difficult, and particularly in your first year, the kids sense blood and they go for the kill, basically.
They can smell fear. Yeah.
They can smell fear, and actually, in my first year, I tried to be everybody's friend because I thought that's a cool teacher. But you know what happened, David?
I can take a pretty good guess. Yeah,
you could take. Yeah, they walked all over me. And my head of department. She pulled me aside and said, "You've made a stinker here, haven't you? You can never." She said, "When you have two decisions to make, always make the one that you can then ease up from. So you should have started tough, and then you can ease up from them. Because if you start soft, or easy, you can't become then a tough, cookie." And she said, "This is the same in all decisions, right? It's the same as when you're communicating. Always start short." With small communication, because then you can expand. But as if you go with the long communication. So she always taught me to think about when you have two choices, pick the one that still allows you some optionality afterward. So really good leadership for me. Those not just the lesson I learned, but the way she told it. She waited. She probably could have seen the car crash coming, but she let me fail. And that's actually been an ethos that I use when training other people or trying to lead them. Because there's only so much you can read in a book, but until you've actually got some scars on your back, so to speak, you're actually going to listen and change your style. And in a similar way, one of the best things when I moved into the business world, the great leadership for me was a leader who did live feedback. So 3 or 4 times a day would give me feedback, very small pieces of feedback based on the meeting we just had, the phone call we just had, little things like, you used too much, but also positive stuff. And so I got so used to getting regular pieces of feedback and giving regular pieces of feedback. That's such a game changer for most people who in their careers don't get sufficient or good quality enough feedback.
Yeah, I like the letting you fail thing, because the temptation there is to jump in and say, no, don't do that. This is why. But I think it's less effective, particularly people earlier in their careers, because, the impetuousness of youth and all that, we're less likely to take it on board, aren't we? I like the live feedback thing as well, but I feel like that's going to be really difficult to get right. And I can see you getting yourself into this position where you're like, I've got to give some feedback, but I don't know. I'll make something up. Or
just imagine. So before this podcast, for example, and you and I chatted just before. Imagine you'd ask me, what would you like to get out of this podcast? Like one thing. Then you give me feedback on that. So the other person is providing the sort of the guidance of, hey, can you really focus on this? And this is where I'm happy for you to give me feedback. So it stops the just give me any spurious thing, but also it says, hey, don't tell me about my dress sense or whatever, tell me about, my confidence or, because that's the area. Yeah. So it was a really but like you said, it takes some practice. But because I got exposed to this very early, it's something I've just carried on. And actually, I missed when I moved on to my second leader who didn't do that. And I was like, "Hey, can we do that?" And he was like, "What's that?"
Yeah, it's not something I've experienced, I must say. It sounds interesting. And yeah, I mean, it obviously did you some good, as you say. So yeah, nice one. Okay, so maybe that leads into the next question. I don't know. The next question is, what's the best thing you've ever seen a leader do?
Yeah, I mean, those examples I've given are natural things, but I think in general, it is linked to that feedback. It's giving up it's creating the time to give to other people, and making it seem effortless, right? What I mean by that is, often when I'd sit with that manager of mine, it never dawned on me that they were a busy person. That, they never seemed stressed or rushed in those giving me that much feedback during a day, because for them that was a worthwhile investment, and they kind of held at bay all the other things. So it made it seem like it was really quality time dedicated to me, which so I felt special. So I think that's the thing great leaders do. They kind of give over their time, but also don't do it in a way that it doesn't seem like it's a chore.
Yes, absolutely. Like the worst experiences that have stuck in my mind are the ones where you just ask for like a simple question and you get or a look at the watch or check something on their phone, or anything to make you feel like what you've asked is their least important priority right now, which is the absolute opposite of what a leader should be doing.
Exactly.
Yeah, really good. What's the biggest mistake then, do you think, that a leader or manager can make?
Well, you can flip anything I've said around.
Yeah, but that's the easy answer. Come on.
Oh, that's easy. I think the biggest mistake is it kind of sits above. It's not asking enough questions and not trusting your team. So you can't be a leader without followers. And if you don't put trust in followers, they will soon stop following you. They might turn up to work every day. So it goes hand in hand with that humility side, sort of releasing. You've got to at some point let go and say, actually, I trust these people, because you can't achieve everything yourself. We've all had those micromanager leaders, manager. So really good leaders are not, and I'm not saying from day one. Sometimes trust has to be earned, but not giving enough trust and not letting go soon enough.
Yes, I think you're right. Particularly interesting, actually, that you said they'll still turn up to work, and I think that speaks to a lot of the trends that we're seeing in the headlines of late about quiet quitting and great resignation, things like that, where them showing up and being at work doesn't necessarily mean they're following you as a leader. No. And so there's a level to which people will still do things in return for the paycheck versus what they might do if they believe in you, trust you, respect you as a leader. And yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, there's a world of difference if you get it right.
Yeah, it makes your job a lot easier. But
that too, yeah.
But there's a lot of fear. It's the other side of the coin, and people can't imagine. Largely because they've not experienced it themselves. A lot of new leaders really struggle with that.
Yeah, I think so as well. And people rail against these horrible leaders, these bad bosses, the people who they're just, I hate them, they're a terrible person. But I think it's easy to forget that most of the time they're not doing it maliciously. They're just doing it because they don't know any better. They've not been taught another way of doing it, and they're just emulating the way they've been managed.
Yeah.
And so I think there's a bit of grace could go both ways in these situations.
It can do, yeah. Often the teams I work with, it's as you say, it's a two-way street. There's ingrained behaviours both ways. So it's not just a case of saying the leader needs to improve. His team or her team needs to learn how to, if they are going to change, how do you need to change to make the most of that? Because often there's a parent-child relationship where it should be an adult-adult, which means both parties have to work on something.
Yeah, absolutely. The parent-child dynamic is so dysfunctional, isn't it, in the workplace?
It's very dysfunctional.
And you wonder, don't you? You just wonder how people get themselves stuck in those situations sometimes. But then, having been in that situation previously in another job, I realise it's not something that happens intentionally. you don't actually realize it's happened until it's too late.
No. And so sometimes the greatest thing is just holding a mirror up. And that's often what I do just as part of my business, particularly when working with certain leaders, is show them the fact, hold up the mirror, and then hopefully they will come round and say, actually, yeah, something needs to change here.
Yeah, which is another great lesson. Cultivate that self-awareness, the self-reflection. Is using the word reflection a bit too on the nose when you said mirror? That's fine, I've done it now.
Yeah, as my friend Ben at university used to say to me, he said, the role I fulfill in your life, Faris, is to bring you down a peg or two, because everyone needs somebody like that in their life. It's a bit tongue-in-cheek, but every leader needs someone who will just tell them how it is and give them a real insight. And as you say, as you get more senior, you lose those people for different reasons.
Well, on the subject maybe of university friends,
yes.
If you could go back in time in that wonderful future world where time travel has been invented,
yes,
what career advice would you give to your younger self?
Well, my DeLorean is already revved up, but I think it'd be twofold. One is around asking more questions and not being afraid. It's kind of along that humility of saying I don't know. I think there was a lot of times in my career I pretended I knew the answer, whereas I was secretly, bricking it. And that's okay actually, because by asking questions, lots of great things can happen. And the other thing is like many young people, I was in such a rush. I thought I had to chase every promotion. I had to do everything. And actually, you reach a point and realize it's a marathon, not a sprint. And, a lot of my colleagues who sprinted have burnt out long ago. And actually, my life is no worse off for having, missed a promotion by a year or something. But when you're in your 20s, you don't realize that. So somehow instill that it's okay kind of philosophy on my younger self.
Yeah, that's good advice. I love anything around leading with curiosity and questions instead of fear or the other things. And it's funny, actually, I was just talking to someone else earlier about this, the power of asking questions. And we were talking about a memory I have from my school days where a teacher very early on said, always ask the question. Don't be afraid of looking stupid, because 9 times out of 10, maybe even 10, there'll be somebody else in the room with that same question who's too afraid to ask. So even if you look stupid, you've helped that person.
Well, yeah, it's
that's always stuck with me.
Yeah, and basically you've just explained the why Google is so powerful, right? Well, anytime you type in a question, someone else has already typed it in, and that's what we all rely on, right? But yeah, it sounds simple, but it's very hard. That we learn to stop asking questions for different reasons very early on. The question, and the flip side, the other great thing you should do is listen more. You can't, if you ask a question, you're not listening, then what's the point? But too many of us don't listen well enough.
Yeah, well, I think that's why leading with curiosity and questions is so useful, because in a way it kind of forces your mindset to shift into listening, doesn't it? Because if you're speaking via questions instead of just for the sake of speaking, you're more likely to make your ears work, I find. Anyway, maybe that's just me.
I completely agree, then.
Good, I'm glad. Yeah.
Leadership Heroes.
If you had to pick one person, and they could be alive or dead, past, present, real or fictitious, who in your opinion would perfectly embody leadership, who would that person be and why?
Okay. This was the question I was dreading most, because I'm the kind of person who says there is nobody who embodies pure leadership, which I take comfort from, because actually you can't be the checklist of everything. I remember several years ago, I was asked by the company I was at to nominate somebody for International Women's Day as my hero, a female hero. And then there was a brackets, please don't pick your mum. Everyone else has picked their mum. So I was like, I started looking at people and I was like, oh, I'm going to pick Mother Teresa. And then, I just Googled quickly because I thought I knew about Mother Teresa. And then you realize there's a scandal behind Mother Teresa. And then you're like, oh, I'm going to pick this person. And then you realize, people were picking Hillary Clinton and there's a scandal behind Hillary Clinton. So And then I was like, come on. And then I expanded my search. So there must be some, people we've thought from leadership across the years who is completely blemish free. But, everyone, even Gandhi, Martin Luther King, Nelson Mandela, somebody views them with a blemish, unfortunately. So, but that's the reality of life, right? You can still be a great leader, but without ticking absolutely every box. So it'd have to be some mythical made up person, unfortunately from the fictitious sense, that embodies, I'm thinking some of the fantasy novels I used to read as a kid, or some of the modern sort of Harry Potters and stuff. And I'm still not giving you a specific name. You're probably like, come on, Faris, just give us a name. So yeah, there is no perfect leader. So just, I could pick people who are pretty close. I like the likes of Albert Einstein. I don't think he was particularly a great leader because he was a bit too focused on the IQ and not enough necessarily. But I think those are good kind of leaders. If only they were better connected with the rest of the world, would be a perfect combination.
Yeah, I find it hard to argue with anything you said. And I do quite often offer the caveat that accepting that perfect is unattainable.
Yeah,
it is an opinion question, really. But yeah, okay.
Well, then like Jerry from Tom and Jerry. He always got his way. He influenced those around him. He created a lot of fun, and he was only sort of about 6 inches tall. So
yeah, fair enough, I guess.
You've never had that answer, David.
No, I certainly haven't. But then we've not had Einstein either. That's quite an interesting pick as well. Yeah, I mean, there's that. I don't know if it's true, but there's the story about where he does the maths in front of the school kids and he does it deliberately wrong. Yeah, he does the 9 times table or something, and that's quite an interesting leadership lesson, isn't it? Parable, if you want.
Exactly. Yeah.
But then also his stance on nuclear weapons, I think, was, for the time, given the context of what was going on, the courage it must have taken to speak out against something that most people saw as the way to win the war. I mean, that's something you have to admire, don't you? Especially in hindsight, knowing everything we know that's happened since. But yeah. So I think it's fair to call him a leader. To be honest, I think he was leading by example, if nothing else.
Yeah. Think how many people still reference him, still follow him. That for me is all the echoes of and the hallmarks of a great leader. Yes,
not without his controversies either, though. Of course. That's we sadly know. Yeah, it's funny. I mean, like I said, I agree with everything you said there about there being no perfect leader. I mean, the one for me that always sticks out in that kind of example is Winston Churchill, because everyone throws him up. But I mean, there were some big controversies in his life.
There are. So yeah.
I guess context is the most important thing, isn't it? That's
it is. And obviously, you're probably doing this podcast. We're both UK based, so there's going to be a UK Western bias. But there are probably amazing leaders that we are oblivious to from the Eastern world, the developing world. So go listen to more podcasts, find out who those people are, and read all about them.
Yeah, very true indeed. Well, Faris, it's been excellent talking to you today. Thank you for sharing your wisdom, your insights, and some great stories as well. Last thing I'll do at the end of the episode is, if the listeners would like to learn more about you, if perhaps they would like some help with their strategy at work, is there a way that they can get in touch with you?
Well, they're very fortunate. There is. They can look me up. Probably the best thing. 2 things are: one is look up my company website, which is, the company's called Shiageto. That's Shiageto. And it's the Japanese word for a sharpening stone, because that's what we do for companies. We sharpen them. So it's www.shiageto.com, or look me up on LinkedIn. I spend a disproportionately large amount of time there. By choice, and look for Faris Aranki, and we'll carry on the conversation.
Awesome. And I'll put links to both of those in the episode description so the listeners can find them easily. Well, that's it. That was it from me. So thanks again. Really great talking to you.
Thank you.
Thank you again, Faris, for your time. That was a very interesting conversation. Particularly enjoyed talking about Einstein, as we've not had him come up before. Listeners, as promised, if you would like to learn more about Faris and what he does, learn about his company, Shiageto Consulting, you can find a website link in the episode description, as well as a link to Faris's LinkedIn profile. So do reach out to him. I'm sure he'd love to hear from you. If you are a new manager, and I hope you are, because that is who this podcast is for, and you are looking for help with establishing yourself as a leader, with getting the most from your team, with overcoming that imposter syndrome that many new managers feel as they navigate that transition from practitioner to leader, then Leading with Integrity is here to help. Your first port of call should be www.leadernotaboss.com. There you will be able to join my online leadership community. It is exclusively available to my podcast listeners and to my past clients. It is there to build a community of like-minded individuals, people at the same stage of their careers, as well as to get access to all of my knowledge and experience on leadership, in the hopes that it will help you make that transition easier. So if you are interested, again, the link is in the episode description and on the website. Please do visit, please sign up, please reach out to me on LinkedIn if you have any questions, and I hope to hear from you soon. Join us again next week. We'll have another great guest and another brilliant conversation about leadership. And in the meantime, stay safe, take care of yourselves, think about your strategy, and as always, remember, be a leader, not a boss.